A Chinese-made surface-to-air missile shot down an American F-15E Strike Eagle over the mountains of southwestern Iran in April. The United States Air Force has not formally said this. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has not formally said this. CNN's intelligence sources, briefed on April 11th, said it. NBC's defense correspondents, citing two senior U.S. officials, said it. The Ukrainian open-source defense outlet Militarny geolocated the wreckage to a position near the city of Yashuj in Kol-Ua and Boyer Ahmad province and identified the launch system as an FN-16, a man-portable air defense, a Chinese state-owned defense conglomerate. An F-15E Strike Eagle cost the U.S. taxpayer approximately $87 million. The FN-16 that took it down costs, by the most credible open-source estimate, somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. That is an asymmetry ratio of better than 1,000 to 1, and according to U.S. intelligence officials briefed to CNN on April 11th, a fresh shipment of those same FN-16s is currently moving, not directly from a Chinese port to an Iranian port, because that would be too obvious. It is moving through third countries, UAE re-export channels, Iraqi overland routes through Basra, possibly Omani transshipment through Salalah, though that one is less confirmed. This is Professor Stephen. Forget the headlines about diplomacy. The war you are watching is no longer a U.S. versus Iran war. It is a U.S. versus China war fought with Iranian hands, and the most consequential strategic development of the last 60 days has been a Chinese Defense Ministry decision that has not appeared in a single mainstream press conference and has not been named in a single congressional hearing. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because the next 20 minutes are going to reframe everything you thought you understood about who is actually fighting this war and who is paying the bill. Let's start with what a MANPADS actually is, because the terminology gets thrown around and most viewers' mental image is 50 years out of date. A MANPADS, Man-Portable Air Defense System, is a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile. The American Stinger is one. The Russian Igla is another. The Chinese FN-16 is, by the technical assessments published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, a near-direct counterpart to the Russian Igla-S. It uses a passive infrared seeker with a dual-band sensor designed to defeat the flare countermeasures that modern Western aircraft deploy. Maximum effective altitude is approximately 15,000 feet. Maximum effective range is approximately 6 kilometers. It is launched by one human being, from the shoulder, from the back of a pickup truck or hillside or a rooftop, and it can be operational from a cold-stowed position in under 30 seconds. That is the weapon system that is now, according to CNN's reporting and Militarny's geolocation work, in the hands of IRGC air defense crews operating across western and southwestern Iran. And here's the part that the headlines are not stating clearly enough. The F-15E Strike Eagle that went down on April 8th was operating at low altitude on what the Pentagon's own initial release described as a deep strike interdiction mission. It was not flying at 30,000 feet, well above MANPADS' engagement envelope. It was inside that envelope. That decision was made by mission planners working under specific operational pressure to put precision-guided munitions on hardened targets in the Zagros mountain chain. Those targets, most likely IRGC missile storage facilities, could not be reliably struck from high altitude because the bunker geometry required a near-direct angle of attack. The Strike Eagle came down because it was doing the only mission its airframe was uniquely suited to do, in the only altitude window where that mission was tactically viable, against a weapon system the air component planners had not assumed would be present in numbers. Take a second on that. The most expensive air superiority strike platform in the United States Air Force inventory was lost to a Chinese-manufactured shoulder-fired missile worth less than the deductible on the aircraft's own insurance, because the people planning the mission did not have an updated threat picture that reflected what was actually in IRGC hands. Now consider how those weapons got there. The Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Iran-China tracker, maintained by FDD senior fellow Craig Singleton, identifies the pattern. It is not new. It has been documented since at least 2023 in open-source procurement intelligence. The pattern is this. China does not ship weapons directly to Iran because direct shipments are diplomatically toxic and technically traceable. China ships weapons to a third party, usually a Chinese state-owned trading company registered in a permissive jurisdiction, and that trading company onward ships to a regional broker. The regional broker, very often based in Iraq or the UAE, then arranges the final overland or coastal transfer. The April 11th CNN report cited U.S. intelligence officials describing the current shipment as being prepared, in their phrasing, for delivery through standard re-export channels. Those re-export channels are not theoretical, they are mapped. They have been the subject of 3 separate Treasury Department designations under Operation Economic Fury, designations announced May 2nd, May 7th, and May 23rd, with specific named entities in Sharjah, in Erbil, and in Salalah. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, in his press conference on May 24th, used the phrase second and third tier intermediary jurisdictions 4 times. That is bureaucratic English for the countries the weapons are physically passing through to disguise the country of origin. And then, the Chinese embassy in Washington, through its spokesperson Liu Pengyu, issued a written denial on April 12th, 1 day after the CNN report. The denial is worth reading in its actual language, because the language is the tell. Liu's statement said, and I'm quoting from the embassy's posted release, that China exercises strict and prudent management of military exports and has consistently opposed proliferation activities that violate international law. It did not deny that FN-16 systems exist in Iran. It did not deny that Norinco has ever sold to a re-export intermediary that subsequently moved product to Iran. It denied a category of activity, proliferation, without denying any specific transaction. That language is, in the diplomatic register, an admission of plausible deniability rather than a denial of fact. China is telling the world it does not directly arm Iran. China is not telling the world its industrial supply chain does not arm Iran. Those are different sentences, and the gap between them is the policy. Donald Trump, asked about the CNN report at a Rose Garden press event on April 15th, said only that Beijing was creating big problems for itself if the reports turn out to be accurate. That phrase, big problems, is the same phrase Trump used in February about Russian-North Korean ammunition transfers, in January about Iranian drone exports to the Houthis, and in November about Chinese fentanyl precursor exports. It is a phrase that signals displeasure without committing to a specific response. The Royal United Services Institute in London, in a research note published May 9th by senior research fellow Siddharth Kaushal, observed that the phrase functions in current American grand strategy as what Kaushal called a deferred cost commitment device, a way of accumulating future leverage without spending current political capital. Let me catch myself here because I don't want to oversell it. There is a Steelman for the Chinese denial, and I want to give it its strongest form. The Steelman runs like this. Many of the components moving through the third country routes Treasury has been designating are not finished weapon systems. They are subassemblies, seeker heads, propellant grains, gyroscopic stabilizers, fire control electronics. The argument is that China is exporting dual-use industrial components to legitimate trading partners, and what happens to those components after they leave Chinese jurisdiction is, legally speaking, no longer Beijing's problem. The Vienna document and the Wassenaar arrangement, the international export control frameworks that govern these transfers, are built around end-use certification, not chain of custody enforcement. China is, by this reading, in technical compliance with the letter of the regime, even if it is in clear violation of the spirit. That is the Steelman. I want to give it its full weight before I refute it. The refutation is that Militarny's geolocation of the April 8th wreckage included serial number imagery on a recovered launch tube fragment. The serial number, partially obscured by impact damage, was nonetheless legible enough for analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies to match it against a Norinco production batch documented in a 2023 leaked Chinese Defense Ministry procurement file. That production batch was contracted by an export entity in Dubai whose ownership traces through a chain of 3 holding companies back to a Chinese state-owned defense conglomerate registered in Shanghai. The chain is, by CSI as senior fellow Jude Blanchette's assessment, tighter than the comparable Russian-Iranian Shahed chain that the Treasury Department has been sanctioning for 2 years. If Treasury is willing to sanction Russian-Iranian transfers on that level of chain integrity, the same evidentiary standard applied to the Chinese-Iranian transfer points unambiguously at Beijing. The dual-use industrial components defense, in other words, is not what the evidence actually shows. The evidence shows finished MANPADS units arriving in Iranian hands through a transshipment chain that begins and ends inside Chinese state ownership. And here's the second piece of the chain that should make American defense planners uncomfortable. The FN-16 is not the only Chinese system that has been geolocated to the Iranian theater since the war began. Jane's Defense Weekly published a confirmed imagery analysis on May 10th identifying HQ-17 short-range air defense launchers, a Chinese derivative of the Russian Tor M1, at two separate IRGC garrison positions outside Isfahan. The Hudson Institute's Iran-China Track 2 project, led by senior fellow Michael Doran, documented in its June 1st quarterly update that at least one battery of HQ-9B long-range surface-to-air missile launchers, which is China's S-300 analog, has been logistically positioned in the vicinity of Bushehr. None of those systems crossed the Iranian border in 2026. They have been there for between 8 and 18 months. What the April F-15E shootdown revealed is not a new shipment. It is the operationalization of a Chinese air defense ecosystem that has been quietly assembled inside Iran across the entire pre-war period, and that is now being layered with shorter-range MANPAD supplements to close the engagement altitude gaps the higher-end systems leave exposed. Now consider this. The April F-15E loss was not a one-off. The Air Force has confirmed 2 additional MANPADS lock-on incidents since April 1 against an F-16 Fighting Falcon operating out of Al Udeid on April 23rd and 1 against an A-10 Thunderbolt operating in support of ground operations near Bandar Abbas on May 5th. Neither aircraft was lost. Both pilots successfully executed flare and maneuver countermeasures, but the incident frequency is climbing. The Pentagon's Threat Warning Bulletin, the one circulated to combatant commanders weekly, has been raising the MANPADS line item severity rating for 6 consecutive weeks. CENTCOM is now, per Bloomberg's reporting on May 29th, operating under a force protection posture that limits low-altitude strike sorties to a list of pre-cleared target categories that has shrunk by approximately 40% since the start of the war. That is a quietly enormous statement. The American military's primary instrument of force projection in the Middle East, the ability to strike anywhere with low-altitude precision air power, is being constrained, in real time, by the presence of a Chinese-built weapon system that costs less than the per-flight hour operating costs of the aircraft it is meant to kill. Let me bring this back to what it means for the United States in terms of military deployment and your tax dollars, because the strategic story has a direct domestic budget tail. The Department of Defense's supplemental appropriation request transmitted to Congress on May 22nd includes a line item of $2.7 billion for what the DoD calls Tactical Air Force Protection Enhancement, DIRCM systems, infrared signature reduction kits, additional flare dispensers, and accelerated procurement of the Group I and Group II counter MANPADS capability that was originally scheduled for fiscal 2028. That $2.7 billion is not theoretical money. It is real money, appropriated from a discretionary budget that is already running a deficit, that will hit your tax obligation in fiscal years 2027 and 2028. The supplemental also includes $1.1 billion in force protection construction for forward bases, hardened hangars at Al Udeid, additional Patriot battery deployments at Al Dhafra, and the long-deferred construction of a third runway at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, which Bloomberg reported on June 1st is now being expedited specifically to disperse the regional F-15E and F-16 footprint. Add it together in a war that started as a choke point dispute over a 21-mile waterway has now produced a roughly $4 billion supplemental defense appropriation. A permanent restructuring of CENTCOM's air sortie posture. A Senate appropriations debate over whether to accelerate the F-15EX program to replace combat losses, and a quiet conversation inside the Pentagon, reported by Defense One on June 4th, about whether the entire post-1990 assumption of American air dominating your tax bill is going to absorb the consequences of this for the rest of the decade, regardless of how the war itself ends. But here's the case for it mattering even more than the budget line, and I want to land this carefully because it's the most consequential point in the entire video. If the cheapest, most exportable, most repeatable weapon system in the Chinese defense industrial catalog can systematically erode the operational viability of the most expensive air platform in the American inventory, then the precedent extends far beyond Iran. It extends to Taiwan. It extends to the Korean Peninsula. It extends to every operating environment where the United States has assumed that the qualitative superiority of its air platforms can offset the quantitative density of an adversary's surface-to-air threat. The Iran theater is, by every Pentagon strategic study published since 2019, a lesser version of the Taiwan threat. If a lesser version is degrading American operational freedom this materially, the greater version is not survivable on current assumptions. Let me bring it back to ground, to what you can actually watch for, because I'd rather give you instruments than predictions. Watch 3 things over the next 4 weeks. First, watch the Treasury Department's OFAC designation list every Friday afternoon. The pattern to look for is the appearance of named entities in jurisdictions outside the UAE, Iraq, and Oman. Places like Mongolia, like Turkmenistan, like Belarus. The day OFAC starts naming intermediaries outside the Gulf re-export corridor is the day the routing has been forced further out, which means Treasury is actually disrupting the supply chain. If the OFAC list stays geographically static, the chain is still flowing. Second, watch the Pentagon's daily CENTCOM press release for any reference to permissive air environment or low-altitude operations. Both phrases were used routinely in March and April. Both phrases have not appeared in a CENTCOM release since May 15th. The day either phrase comes back is the day the threat is being assessed as having been suppressed. If they stay absent, the constraint is permanent. Third, watch the Chinese Foreign Ministry briefings. Liu Pingju's denial in April was carefully constructed. The day a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson uses the phrase "China supports a political solution" without including any version of the strict management of exports formula is the day Beijing is signaling a willingness to renegotiate the supply chain. If the strict management language stays in every statement, the supply chain is being protected. 3 instruments. OFAC's geographic spread. CENTCOM's vocabulary. The Chinese Foreign Ministry's formulas. Watch those 3, and you'll see the strategic shape of the proxy war before it shows up in casualty figures. So let me leave you with the question I cannot fully answer myself, and I'll hand it to you. If the cheapest shoulder-fired missile in the Chinese defense catalog can structurally constrain the most expensive air superiority platform in the United States arsenal, and if the chain of custody from a Shanghai-registered defense conglomerate to a Yasuj hillside can be mapped tightly enough to satisfy the same Treasury evidentiary standard that has been used to sanction Russian-Iranian transfers for 2 years, then what exactly is the air superiority assumption that American Gulf strategy hay? The premise of every Gulf-basing decision since Operation Desert Shield has been that American air power owns the sky. The April 8th wreckage outside Yasuj is the first piece of empirical evidence that the premise has expired. Beijing knows. Tehran knows. The question is when Washington stops writing supplementals and starts writing a new doctrine. This is Professor Stephen. I'll see you in the next one.